You are listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with Steve Worsley, the toxic mold expert and your number one source for mold consulting and mitigation in the USA. Let's dive into a brand new episode. Before we get started on this episode, here's a not-so-short disclaimer. While all attempts have been made to verify the content provided in this podcast, neither the podcaster or the producers assume any responsibility for errors, omissions, or alternative interpretations of the issues discussed here. All information stated in this podcast is the opinion of Steve Worsley. Steve Worsley is a mold specialist with over 25 years of experience in the construction and mold industry. The Toxic Mold Podcast is for information sharing purposes only. The views expressed are those of the podcaster and his alone. These views should not be taken as expert instruction or commands. While there may be references to medical conditions and symptoms, all podcast episodes are the opinion of Steve Worsley, and any medical questions or concerns shall be addressed with the appropriate licensed medical professional or professionals. As the podcaster refers to different mold types, please be aware that Steve Worsley is not a microbiologist, and questions concerning mold specifics should be answered by the appropriate professional. Steve isn't, nor does he offer any legal advice. For any legal advice, you must speak with a lawyer. The listener is 100% responsible for his or her own actions. You can check out Steve's books on Amazon. Just go to Amazon and search for author Steve Worsley. You can also take Steve's courses on Udemy or Skillshare, and you can find out more about those at cnccontractorservices.com. Now, let's get to the episode.
Hello, you're listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with myself, Steve Worsley, and we have my wife, Cassandra, again. How are you?
Good. How's it going?
Just another day in paradise. So we're into the July heat. Hope everybody had a great 4th of July and stayed safe.
Yeah.
So today we have an interesting topic. It's something that comes up quite often, especially for mold remediators, but it's PRV testing after toxic mold remediation. Do you know what PRV means?
Post remediation verification.
Good job.
That was a guess.
So yes, what PRV testing is post-remediation verification. And a lot of people, it's a tough subject, and the reason we'll get into all of that. But part of mold remediation, I know for us, other companies are going to do things however they want. After our 48-hour cool down period, we go in and do testing.
Okay.
And the point of the testing is to see what the air quality looks like, and we do surface sampling.
Just to make sure that the remediation worked.
Yes.
Okay.
And it's, once again, when we do remediation, we talked about mycotoxins last week. And as I always say, mold is the gift that keeps on giving. And we want to make sure there's not some major issues going on. And it's honestly not uncommon to find issues. So I'll explain to our listeners, they probably all understand air testing. We use a low volume air pump. It sucks air through, I use aerosol cassettes, and it sucks them through a cassette. It traps everything on a slide. And then, we do one air test for one room. We do an outside baseline. Then we take the cassette. So let's just say we do one outside. The second one's inside of our containment. A third one is outside of our containment. We do that. We send it to a lab. The lab analyzes it. They get back to us and tell us what it is. That's an air test. A surface sample, it can be done with either biotape, which is literally Scotch tape that's on a slide, or you can do a swab, which a swab is literally like a Q-tip, but just it's got a longer stick. Matter of fact, it's the same medical swabs they use for strep throat.
Okay, that makes sense.
And so I don't prefer to do swabs unless it's in an area you can't get to.
Mm-hmm.
I prefer to do the tape lift. You literally stick it. Let's just say we're, doing remediation in a basement bedroom. Part of our remediation, we have to abrasively remove the mold, which you can dry ice blast, baking soda blast, wire brush, or sand. We sand. So what we do is, depending on how deep the mold growth goes into the building material, we at least have to hit it 2 or 3 times by sanding it. And my point is we do a tape lift right there to make sure we sanded deep enough. Sometimes it's just, we go until there's no discoloration, but sometimes we still don't even get it enough.
Do you recommend, though, that people wait I know when people pay for mold remediation, they're anxious to know how long is it going to take. They're anxious to know how long am I going to be on my house. They really want to know, when am I going to get back into my house? When are you going to be done? But I kind of look at this like when you're building a brand new home, and before you can move into the home, you have to get some letter of occupancy, don't you?
Yeah, CO is what it's called. What Certificate of occupancy.
So before you can move into a house that you've built, you have to get a certificate of occupancy. Isn't the PRV results like a certificate of occupancy following mold remediation? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of times people don't wait because we're from start to finish. So I mentioned the cool down period is 48 hours. That cool down period, all we're doing is running air scrubbers, depending on the situation, maybe ozone machines, but more or less nobody's in the house. So we don't let people stay there while we're doing remediation. We finish the mold removal, sanding, all the chemicals we use. Once the cool down period starts, we go 2 days of zero activity. Then as soon as that 48 hours is over with, we go back in, we run the air test, we do the surface sampling inside of our containments. Well, at that point, if you think about it, at a minimum, that's a 3-day process. That's virtually impossible for mold remediation because it usually takes us a good day just to get, our trailer there, the floor protection down, the containment's up. I mean, that's typically 1 day. Second day is mold removal. So let's just say it's simple. We don't have to pull a water heater out. We don't have to pull out sinks or anything like that. Then you have 1 day of, once again, depending on the size of it, removing the wall coverings, floor coverings, whatever we're removing. We obviously do flood cuts. We have to chase the mold. And just depending on what we encounter, you're at least a day and a half doing, all the removal of the wall coverings and sanding. So at this point, you're 2.5 days into it. Depending on how everything hits, 2 more days after that. And I always build in, I try to. And once again, every situation's different. But for the most part, it's a rare occasion that we can be done within 5 days.
Exactly. So if people are expecting that mold remediation could take a week, depending on their situation, it could take a month. Should they be wanting to come home as soon as the remediation is done? Or is it your recommendation that they wait for the PRV results to come back because more mold remediation might actually be required?
Yeah, we always suggest waiting. But on the other hand, depending, let's just say insurance isn't going to cover anything. Then I understand. Like my clients like Steve, let's just say you have 2-3 children, family of 5, we're renting an Airbnb or hotel or whatever. We get it. Like it's taxing on the family itself. But on the other hand, it's like, well, we want to make sure everything looks good before you move back in. And like I said, mold is the gift that keeps on giving. And sometimes, it's not uncommon. We start opening up wall cavities, and let's just say it includes another room or another bathroom. We could be picking up something in our PRV testing that's from another area that was outside of our containment. And, for our listeners, they're like, well, what if that happens? We have to keep cutting more flood cuts. Like we literally start with just removing baseboards and door trim, looking for water damage. It could be, like you said, up to a month. And it's not, once again, I can only speak for our company, but it's not like we're sitting there dragging our feet. We want to get out of there as quick as we can too. But if you get into a rush, that's when you start running into problems.
Absolutely.
So can you imagine if you started putting the insulation back in, the wall coverings, the floor coverings. If you started doing all that and we don't have PRV results, that you could do that in vain.
Absolutely. So who typically does the PRV testing?
I always recommend a third party because, and actually in some states like New York, I think Texas is going to it. Florida, you have to, which once again, we can talk about that if we want to, but they require a mold assessor, a separate entity from the mold remediation company. I personally, you and I have talked about this. I don't see what's wrong. Like, if you don't trust me as a mold remediation contractor, if you don't trust me enough to do the PRV testing, then you probably shouldn't use me for mold remediation.
Yeah.
So that's, like I said, that's a touchy subject, really depending on who you talk to. I've always said it this way. Would you go to one orthopedic that orders the testing and assesses you, and then you have to go to another one to take care of the shoulder surgery?
No.
I mean, in my opinion, you might as well have the same person taking care of everything.
I agree.
And it's, like I said, I'm sure, and I know some of my fellow professionals, IEPs or whatever you want to call them, would disagree with me on that. But in my opinion, why can't you just use the same company?
That's a good question. I mean, continuity of care matters a lot.
Exactly. Because once again, I mean, it's a really difficult road to go down. And like I said, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds, but I always recommend a third party just so it doesn't look like a conflict of interest for me. But then I give our clients a price to do the PRV testing. And if they decide to go with us to do the PRV, then so be it.
Yeah.
It really works out better that way. We don't put waterproofing or encapsulation in until we do the PRV testing.
Okay. So what should people expect from PRV testing?
Like I said, I think I mentioned it a little bit earlier. You could see worse results for PRV than you did pre-remediation. And it's not uncommon. It really isn't, because we have opened. So let's just give a scenario. Let's say it's a home that has a full basement and then you have a main level above that. Down in the basement, let's say you take some wall covering out. The other side of, let's say we're in a bedroom. The other side of that could be another bedroom, a living room, a bathroom. If it's a bathroom, that's where it gets really tricky, because you're opening up that airspace. And so once you do that, if you have something going on in an area outside of our containments, which is pretty much out of our control, and we're only contracted to remove, X amount of feet of wall coverings, we might be picking something up in a PRV test that we have no control over. Does that make sense?
That does make sense.
And so for our listeners, even a surface sample, yes, do we want a surface sample is either positive for mold or negative. It can be, if it's positive, it could be light, moderate, or heavy. At the end of the day, we should have negative, but if we don't, let's say during our cool down period with the air circulating, if we picked up something in that bathroom and it's sitting there on a sill plate or a wall stud, we're picking that up, and those mold spores could have come from somewhere else.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
So PRV can be very tricky, can be very difficult, because I understand, I get it. You're trying to get back into your home, but on the other hand, we want your home to be safe.
Absolutely. So what's your call to action for people?
Make sure that you understand that PRV testing is like any other test. It's not always just the answer, like everything's fine or everything's terrible. There's a lot of variables that come into play. There's a lot of things you have to consider with PRV testing. And if you don't understand it, you wouldn't understand why the numbers are higher or why there was mold detected or anything.
Okay.
So it's complicated. When people reach out to me and they ask me, a simple question, that's why it's so complex, because there's no simple answer. And that's why we do scope of work, which is an SOW, a work plan, whatever you want to call it. We can do something like that for our listeners. And more or less what it is we know we have a mold in this bathroom or laundry room. I write the scope of work, which lays out every step that should be taken. Once again, for our listeners, this isn't for you as a listener to do it yourself. It's just for you to go to your mold remediation contractor and say this, and like you've got to start with a containment. You've got to put floor protection down. You have to remove the wall covering. Once you remove that, you have to sand. You use this treatment for chemicals. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. So you offer consultations, but you also offer a service that virtually anybody can pay and use, which is that scope of work.
Yes. Yep. And it's not something we have on the website. So for our listeners, if that's something you need, just reach out. Obviously, I'm going to charge you. I can't just do it for free. And here's the thing too. Every scope of work changes for every project.
Exactly.
It's not like a knee surgeon who goes in and does, a scope of the knee and it's the same steps every time.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
So, like I always say, mold is the gift that keeps on giving. Every situation, every family, every person is unique. So we have, like I said, we have consultation packages to address anybody's concerns that they have with mold.
All right.
So perfect. Well, thank you for listening. I hope you all have a great week.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Make sure you go to our website at cnccontractorservices.com and sign up for the mold investigation checklist. Again, go to cnccontractorservices.com and get your free mold investigation checklist today. You can also on cnccontractorservices.com find out more about Steve's courses and books and consultations. Once again, go to cnccontractorservices.com.